Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm Jered Martin, and I'm the co-founder and chief operations officer at OnePitch. And I'm here to talk to you all and teach you all about how to craft pitches that journalists are looking for. So let's discuss for a brief moment, what is a pitch and the different kinds of pitches that there are. There are a couple of different ones that we might be familiar with. The first and foremost, which I'm sure you all know, is a sales pitch. And a sales pitch, usually directed at a customer, it explains the benefits and the value of using a product or service and why that customer is a perfect fit. The next type of pitch is known as an investor pitch. These pitches are typically directed towards firms, VC funds, or angel investors. The point of this pitch is to explain more information about the brand, the problem that you're identifying, and the problem that you're solving, and the opportunity for those investors to earn a return on their investment. And finally, we have a media pitch, and this is what I'm going to focus on most closely today. And a media pitch is typically directed towards a reporter or a journalist or an editor. It identifies something newsworthy about a brand, a company, or an individual, why this person who is receiving this pitch is not only the perfect person to write about it, but why they're also the perfect person to share that information with the public. So who would you ideally pitch in media? There are really three different roles that are taken into consideration when you're pitching media contacts. And I'm going to go through each of those for a brief moment. The first are editors. And editors are essentially the folks that are in charge of the reporting team. They typically work on the assignment desk, and they are either receiving stories from reporters or they're actually assigning stories to their reporters. Editors often dictate what types of stories are worth sharing with the audience, as well as which ones will be published and others that will not be or need to be revisited. The next type of role within media are reporters, and reporters are also known as staff writers. These are employees of news publications. Of course, their title is reporter. A lot of times it will be a reporter of technology, reporter of artificial intelligence. Typically, these folks have a specific beat or coverage area that they focus on. These individuals work for at most maybe 2 news publications, typically only 1. And they, in fact, tend to write a lot of stories throughout the week. And you'll see here that I notated some of them even write 1 to 2 news stories per day. So they are very busy. They have a lot on their plate. Not only that, they're not only working with sources and individuals, but also, again, sharing those stories with their editors on the assignment desk. Last but not least, we have contributors and freelancers. And these are folks who are not direct employees of news publications or outlets. These individuals work on their own. They typically will act like a staff writer in the sense that they do work with brands and companies to work on pitches. And then they take those pitches and they submit them to editors at a news desk. A lot of times, these folks will have, for example, an author page on a news publication website, but it will specify if they're a contributor or maybe if they're a freelancer. There's another really popular term for these individuals where it's referenced as a byline. And there are a number of journalists who do write bylines for a number of different type of publications. Again, the most important thing to recognize is that these folks are not direct staff members of those news publications. So they can tend to be easier to work with, but the chances of getting a story published with them and through them can be a little bit more difficult because of the hurdles that they have to take in order to get that information to the top end of the newsroom. So why do we pitch media? What is the point of pitching media in general? There's what I would consider 3 main components to the reasons for pitching media, and I'll explain those in detail. And all of those relate to, that very last bullet point, which is why this is important for brands to conduct. But when you're pitching media, there's a couple of different things that you'd want to consider. One of them might be exposure. There's a famous saying, putting your brand on their radar or making the presence known. And a lot of times this relates to startups or newer companies in the space, right? You're new, people aren't aware of you. They might not be familiar with your service offerings or your product. So this gives you that opportunity to not only reach out to journalists, but also gives you the opportunity to kind of introduce them to your product or service, which in turn they can take that and introduce it to their audience. The next reason would be announcements. Again, these are related to news that is soon to be available to the public, or it may be related to news that you might have shared on your owned channels, which we would also call like a blog, for example. Announcements range across a bunch of different topics. I'm going to go into all of those specifically in just a moment here. But again, this is another type of reason that you might want to pitch the media. And lastly, commentary. Commentary is what I would consider one of the most popular forms of pitching media, especially with a lot of the news being generated at a very quick pace. We know what is dominating the headlines currently, but outside of this particular time, news moves at a very rapid pace, right? It's always occurring. People are always releasing new news stories. And so providing commentary about that sort of thing from an expert perspective, providing insights about your industry or the market that you work in are really, really important. Or commentary on a breaking news story, which again is also a really popular topic. I'll go into that, and there's a specific term that we reference for commenting on breaking news, or essentially taking advantage of that news and kind of putting a little bit of a spin on it for yourself. But again, why pitch media and why is this important? The main reason why we do this, the main reason why it's important is that you want to get your message in front of the right people at the right time. There might be a number of different goals or reasons for this. It could be, generating sales. Again, it could be generating exposure. But the most important thing to recognize is that you want to get information to the public, to the right people at the right time. So let's talk a little bit about what to pitch media. I know on the previous slide I had mentioned those 3 components, and here's some of those that are broken down a little bit more in detail. I had mentioned exposure as one of those, and again, talking about putting some information on a journalist's radar. And here's some examples of pitches related to exposure. Maybe it's a product launch, maybe it's a product review or a gift guide. And a lot of times you'll see the top 5 best tools, or the 5 things that you should buy mom for Mother's Day. Those are all related to product reviews and gift guides. A lot of them are very consumer focused. There are some that are business focused. They might be tools that businesses can utilize, or some type of technology that they can implement. Again, all of those kind of, again, relate to that exposure aspect. Those are pitches and stories that tend to get written fairly often. So you do have good opportunities to pitch those. The most important thing to remember is just that what is your story and what makes it unique? What is unique about your product or your service and about you as a company? Maybe it's not, a founder per se, but maybe it's somebody who represents the company from a communications perspective. Talk to your founders, talk to your executive team, figure out why this was created. Why are they doing what they're doing? And really drive that narrative of why within that pitch. Another example of what you could pitch to media would be news and announcements. A lot of times people think of public relations and they think of news and announcements as like the core component of PR, of informing the public. That could be related to product updates. It could be related to service offerings that you've added. It could be to funding and partnership announcements, earnings announcements, or even hirings. Again, all of these things revolve around news. And the most important thing to remember about those is that you're trying to inform people about something specific, and you want to do that at the right time. So be mindful of when, and be mindful of how you're presenting that. Keep going down the list. We have expert insights and commentary. Those tend to be a little bit similar, but they're a little bit different, again, in how they're conducted. Expert insights a lot of times revolve around trends. That could be industry trends. It could be forecasts for what's going to happen next year. It could be a reflection of what we thought was going to happen this year versus what did happen. Maybe, for example, your company has conducted a study or a survey. Again, all of these provide a line of credibility for yourself and provide information about not only who you are, but why your company is an expert in the space, and of course, why you're presenting this news and what's interesting and relevant about it. Before we get into those last two, I just want to touch on commentary. I mentioned before there was a really popular type of pitch, which is about taking advantage of breaking news. And there's a really popular form called newsjacking. And really what newsjacking is you're taking a story and it might be, again, relatable to the industry that you're a part of or to a product that you have that's comparable to this news story. And the whole idea is you're kind of taking that news and putting a little bit of a spin on it. You're making it a little bit more unique and personal to who you are. Maybe it's a big problem that's occurring, and you're going to identify that problem and provide a solution for it, or present the reasons why there's a solution that's needed and how you can be a part of that solution. And I'm going to show you an example of a pitch that particularly talks about that in just a moment. But again, just be mindful. Commentary, it can be about breaking news. It can be about news that happened a week ago. But just remember that you want to make sure you tie that in and make it unique to who you are and what you're doing. The last two options on this list, I want to go into a little bit of detail about. Those are a little bit related to one another, but these are two very popular terms that a lot of public relations professionals are familiar with, and those are embargoes and exclusives. And these are really the ways that you pitch stories. Not just the topics of those stories, but how you're presenting it to the individuals that you want to work with. An embargo, for an example, is an agreement to share news with someone ahead of public access. You basically would reach out to them, you say, hey, this news is embargoed for this date. If you're interested in learning more about it, I'd be more than happy to share this information with you, but I need you to agree to this embargo. So that way you don't share this ahead of time. And that way people aren't informed if for whatever reason it's not the right time for them. I see a lot of folks do this on our site as well as outside of there. I know a lot of professionals who take this into consideration when they're pitching stories, and more specifically when they're pitching exclusive stories, which is that last bullet point here. And the reason why exclusive stories are actually a little bit more sought after, and in a sense, a little bit more important than your typical news story or evergreen story, which kind of is more general, is that exclusives provide an opportunity for that specific individual to be the only person who has access to that information. A lot of times, folks will reach out to one journalist. They'll have done a little bit of research. They'll know exactly who this person is, what they write about, why they would be a good fit for the brand that they're pitching or for the company and the product or service that they're pitching. Again, an exclusive is solely to present this to one person. And why that's important is because journalists break news. There's a term called breaking news, which we all know. And journalists are the ones who break that news. They break that information and they share it with the public. And being the first to do that has a lot of different advantages and benefits. One of them being that that's really kind of like a win and a successful, a success point, if you will, a KPI for journalists. They want to be the first to break the news. They want to be the first to share this information with people, to make them aware of it. So if you have the opportunity to pitch a journalist based on an exclusive story, maybe, again, it's a study or a survey you've conducted. Maybe it's a brand new product offering that's going to completely disrupt or going to completely innovate a space that is within. Those would be examples of types of exclusive stories that you'd want to pitch. But the most important thing to remember is that an exclusive should only be directed towards one person. If you're reaching out to multiple people about exclusives, that can potentially hurt your reputation. And the reason being is because if one person agrees to it and then another agrees to it, who gets that information first, right? If they're under the impression that they're the only ones receiving it and then somebody else gets it and they find out about that, the chances of them wanting to work with you are probably going to be much lower because of the fact that you might have broke that embargo or, again, broke the agreement that you had in place. So it's important to remember exclusives, always target that for just one individual. Wait until you hear back from them. If you don't hear back, you can follow up. Typically about 3 days is a good window to follow up with individuals after you've sent that first message. I would highly recommend do not send anything after that. If they haven't responded at that point, you kind of just have to bite the bullet and realize that either they're not interested or it's not the right time for them to write about that particular story. So lastly, let's talk about when to pitch media. All of these statistics on here are not only related to what we've seen on OnePitch, but they're also very popular within the industry. We're constant readers of public relations trade magazines, as well as online publications. There's a lot of other service providers in the space who have, again, validated these same data points. But what we've seen is that when you're pitching media, weekdays are by far the best times. The reason being is because journalists, of course, are working in the newsroom during the week. But typically weekdays are when they're compiling stories. It's when they're bringing together those resources and sources, and not just weekdays alone, but the time of day that they're doing that. And as you can see here, between about 5 a.m. and 12 p.m. Pacific time is the most optimal time to be sending your pitch out to a journalist. Like I mentioned before, the reason being is because this is the time of day that these folks might be compiling resources or looking at all of their research and starting to draft that information. A lot of folks that I speak with on the journalist side mentioned to me that a lot of times they have to submit stories to their editors within the afternoon time. So if you're reaching out to them at 2 or 3 p.m. Pacific time, remember that's 5 or 6 Eastern. So you're way past the deadline at that point. But even in Pacific time, it's still very late in the day. A lot of times they've already moved on to that next subject. As I mentioned to you as staff writers, a lot of times these folks are writing 1 to 2 stories a day. So by 5 a.m. to 12 p.m., they may very well be onto that second story. So it's important, again, that you hit them early, try to get after them within those weekdays, and just be mindful of, again, what they're experiencing, what they're inundated with. I wanted to just mention as well, within this month section, this is not something that's necessarily industry-wide, but something more specifically that we did identify on OnePitch. But we found that June, July, and August were the most successful months for pitches to gain responses and then result in publishing or a placement because of that. And this does correlate a little bit with that seasonal content below. But what we saw was that June, July, and August are a little bit quieter in terms of the time of year and what types of things are happening around that year. As you can see, conferences, holidays, back to school, quarterly, those all kind of have pockets throughout the year. And between June, July, and August in those summer months, the news cycle tends to not just be quiet, because of course we know news is always breaking, but it doesn't really have a theme. It's not focusing on a lot of these things that the other times of years, or the other times throughout the year are, excuse me. So again, just something to notate. One thing we also recognized was that within this particular time frame, consumer-oriented pitches really, really did well in that time. Again, taking into consideration summertime, especially within the States, a lot of people are outdoors. They might be, barbecuing with family or going to the beach or whatever that they might be doing to spend their time. And again, kind of taking that consideration with the timing, knowing that, okay, this is the season for consumers. And this is when not only that they're buying that information, but this is the same time of year that I should be presenting my information to the individuals who are going to share it with those audiences. So now that we've gone through the who, the what, the why, and the how, I'm going to actually show you all how to craft a pitch. And after I show you this slide, I'm going to go in and I'm going to go and provide an example in detail, and we'll pick apart a pitch so you can understand how the individuals set it up and how it relates to these 4 components here. So when you're crafting a pitch, you can almost think of this like an email, for example, right? You click that compose button, your window pops up. You've got a to field, you've got a CC and a BCC field, you've got your subject line, and then you've got your body of your information. So the subject line with a pitch, again, would go into that subject line of your email. And really you want to be mindful of what you're saying within your pitch and try to reflect that within the subject line. What we have seen and what we've heard is that journalists do not want creative and fluffy language. They don't want to see characters or all capitals to try to draw their attention. What they really do prefer is something very specific and direct about what you're telling them. Excuse me. And what's most interesting is that we found not only did journalists prefer that, but in turn, when they saw pitches like that, they were more inclined to open them, and they were able to review the information quicker which got them to that end result. Are they interested or are they not interested? So once you craft that clear subject line, what you want to think about is your request. And again, thinking about that email, this could be what is included in the body of that message. Very similar to the subject line. You want to be short, you want to be concise, you want to be direct. You really want to provide a clear explanation of what you're pitching them. And then in those key details section, you want to explain to them why it's relevant, why it's important to their audience, and why it's worth sharing. And those key details, again, goes into the body of that pitch. Here are some examples of what we recommend and what we've seen done well. Industry data, statistics, key performance indicators, and any type of credible information about the company all help validate and plead the case for not only why this information is interesting and useful, but why you're a relevant resource and why a journalist, again, who is an expert in their space, would be so inclined to learn more about this and want to work together. Last but not least, when it comes to crafting a pitch, there are some extras that you can include. Thinking about that email again, these are what we'd consider like attachments. And these are, again, providing more information for the individuals outside of what you've shared with them within that pitch. A lot of times extras will include photos. As we know, when we're reading news articles, rarely do we see a news article that's just text and doesn't have a photo. So you want to make sure you always have some type of visual component on hand. If you don't have an actual photo file, you can always send them to your website. And if you can be specific, send them to a specific web page, which gives them more information about what you're sharing. I always recommend this to individuals. If you're submitting a pitch to someone and you send them to your homepage, you're essentially, yes, giving them, an easier way to find out about you, but they still have to go around and do the digging. If you can direct them to that right spot, if you can show them exactly what you're telling them within the pitch, which again elaborates a little bit more, it's going to help your case tremendously. Not only that, it's going to save the journalist time. They appreciate that. A lot of them, again, have a lot on their plate. So this is a much easier way for you to earn their trust, earn their interest, and make their job a little bit easier at the same time. So let's go ahead and I'm going to, again, go through this particular example of a pitch that was submitted through OnePitch, and we're going to break this apart based on those 4 components that I just mentioned. So here you can see the pitch. You'll see the subject line in the very top there. One drone can take out a nuclear power plant. The brand or the company that was submitting the pitch was Fordham Technologies. This is their website, and you'll notice the URL for that website is not just the homepage, but it does actually take them to a specific web page. And in this case, they were talking about their drone hunter drone. And so the team at Fordham decided it would be much better to send them to this page, again, where they could find more information, they could refer to images, and they could have more of a description outside of what the pitch was that they presented to them. If we go through these last sections, you'll see what and then why. The what and the why, those are related to those key details. Again, those are related to that request. That's that body of the email. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to explain each of these sections a little bit more in detail now for you. Before we go into that, actually, I do want to mention a little bit of a backstory. I think that's important for you guys to recognize. But back in 2018, drones were becoming more popular and they were gaining more attention in the news headlines. These were drones that were consumer-oriented, business-oriented, as well as government-oriented. And a lot of these headlines were across the board related to those different segments. It could have been, unfortunately, about warfare. It could have been about civilian. It could have been about companies adopting these things. But what was found by the Fordham team was that there was a need for stricter regulations and that there wasn't a lot of conversation going on about that. And there wasn't a lot of solutions to that problem, not just from a regulation perspective, but from other things. And we'll go into that in detail in a moment. But in relation to timing for this story, as those stories began to grow, again, the Fordham team recognized an opportunity for themselves to not just insert their name, but to really insert themselves to show a clear solution to the problem that they were experiencing within that space. And not only that, they were able to catch the attention of the journalist at the right time. with the right story that they presented to them. So let's take a look at that. Starting with the subject line, as I mentioned before, really what you want to focus on is what you're going to say within the body of this message. And if we think about that example, one drone can take out a nuclear power plant. Okay, so as a journalist, my mind is kind of brewing already. I'm kind of thinking, okay, drones, power plants, takeout. Okay, there's some type of security risk involved here. But if we go into a little bit more detail, I did provide some insights there. And we can see the subject line identifies, again, a clear risk involved that had not been discussed yet within the news. Not only that, but it gave a preview to what the company was going to present to them. Okay, so one drone can take out a power plant. Oh, wow. What's the solution for that? How do we fix it? And in this case, again, they're answering that question. So if we go on to that clear request, and it's kind of funny because it might not seem like a very clear request in this section, and I realize that, but the most important thing to look at is how they presented this request. Again, they presented it as a question. Could you imagine what would happen if something were to happen, if a drone was put into the wrong hands? If somebody were to use that drone for malicious intent to, again, hurt some people, or to, again, in this particular case, do something about a power plant, right? Or to essentially put people's lives at risk for some sort of benefit. But again, what I want to make sure that you recognize is that not only did the request here come in the form of a question, but it also kind of drove that narrative for, okay, here's a question that we're going to present to you, but we're also going to provide you directly and specifically with the solution to this. So let's take a look at how that was presented. Looking at the first key detail, this particular team used data and statistics to start off presenting their case. They not only identified the FAA and the number of projects that were growing, but also the risk or the issue related to consumers and how they were a little bit wary and skeptical of where this technology was heading. Again, taking into consideration a lot of those news headlines that were happening around this time, it seems to be like a lot of folks were seeing, okay, there's a lot of warfare, there's a lot of civilian crimes, but nobody's doing anything about it. And again, looking at that from that perspective, that's why this team took this pitch and presented it in a way, again, related to those news stories, but not reflecting those same stories, just asking the question that those all asked, but then providing a different solution. The next key detail, again, uses a little bit of this data and statistics. These are not specific numbers, but what it's pulling from, again, were those articles that were written. And as they could see, as we can read here, most places secured from the ground, but the airspace remains relatively unsecured and wide open for malicious intent. Okay, wow, that's a really big claim, but when we think about it, again, it makes perfect sense. There is nothing essentially policing the skies. And so this team took it upon themselves to say, hey, look, this is happening and we know how to fix it and we can provide that solution. And lastly, looking at KPIs and credible information as those key details, this team incorporated the last bit of information to tell them not only about the company, but what stage they were in, another big name company that they were partnering with. And just as a side note, if you as a company, as a brand, if you're partnered with big names, if you're partnered with recognizable companies, it is really, really important. It is really, really valuable to include that information within a pitch. Not only does it immediately grab the attention of individuals, but again, it does provide more information about what you're doing and it establishes more credibility. Boeing, as we know, is a very well-known company worldwide. They're not going to work with people who are small or who don't have a presence or who have not built something that's actually making a difference. So again, journalists, they're jumping not to conclusions, but they're kind of jumping to say, okay, look, this company's partnered with Boeing. I might look into that, but I can tell that this is something that's going to be worth talking about. Therefore, I should keep my eyes on this and I should look at it a little bit closer. But let's go in and we'll look at the very last part of this. Again, as I mentioned before, visuals are super important. In this particular case, this is an image of the drone that was being pitched on behalf of the Fordham Technologies team. This particular image was on the hyperlink of the website. It wasn't attached to the pitch, but it was on the website. It was available for the journalist. If you reference the article link, which I'll share with you in just a moment, you will see that this was incorporated into there, along with some more information related to that pitch specifically. So I'm sure you're all wondering, okay, this pitch has been crafted. That's a great example, Jered, but did it actually perform to expectation? Did it get results? And I'm happy to say that yes, it did. Going back to, again, when, right? When should we be pitching journalists? Some statistics we'll see presented here. So for example, the pitch was responded to by 8 a.m. Pacific time. It was sent out at 5 a.m. and within 3 hours, it had gained a response from a well-known, reputable journalist. Not only that, he expressed interest in the story, and then him, along with the team at Fordham, proceeded to work together to produce this article. And one thing that I want to mention is PR, media relations, crafting pitches, sending them out, all of that stuff, it tends to be a long game. It's not something that you're going to get easy wins, that it's going to happen overnight. Yes, that can happen. Some people get lucky. I can guarantee you that it may happen once or twice, but a lot of times this is typically how this process is conducted. Is you might get connected with somebody, there might be interest, but then it's going to take some time to work together. In the case of this example, this journalist just simply wasn't ready to produce or publish that story yet. He needed to conduct his own research. He wanted to learn a little bit more about the space, and not just the drone space specifically, but regulations, and looking at the way this pitch was presented to really formulate something that was going to be interesting for the readers. And you'll see here at the very, very bottom, this piece was published on Digital Trends. It was pitched in July of 2018, or August, I believe, and it was published on their website, I believe, in October of that same year. So again, just kind of taking into consideration what we talked about when pitching journalists, not only do they take advantage of a time of year, pitching in July when it was a little bit quieter, they sent out the pitch at the right time, they got the response back within the right time, it happened on the weekday, and then as a result, they worked together and produced that published article. So let's talk a little bit about takeaways for today. We obviously went over a lot of information. I hope you all found it valuable, but just as a summary, know who you're pitching, know what you're pitching, know when you want to pitch it. Identify your goals, figure out who you want to target, do your research, get an idea of who are the best people to write about your brand, and then take it upon yourself to really plan accordingly. Not only that, know your story. Take the time to dig into your story. Again, thinking about those executives, the CEOs, the founders. Why did they create this company? What is their goals? What is the mission? What are the values? How can that information be incorporated into the pitch that you're sharing? Not only that, sometimes it's really helpful to ask for feedback. One component of our service at OnePitch that we really are big believers on is we provide feedback to individuals about their pitches. The reason being, when you're a small team, you may not have anybody looking at it, or you may not have the expertise to know what's good or what's not good. Not only that, if you're working in an agency setting, sometimes a lot of junior staffers are left to do pitching, but they're not receiving a lot of guidance from the managers above them, the folks who have been doing it for years. So again, asking for feedback is really, really helpful, not only to peers within your space, but sometimes asking for feedback from journalists can be helpful. This is something that I've done. I will admit I've never had a 100% response rate in regards to it, but there have been folks who have been inclined to give some feedback to me. And at the same time, at the same token, you can kind of think of this like, again, putting it on your radar. Hey, Jane, Joe, I had some questions for you about this company. I'm trying to formulate this message. What do you think about this? Is this something that might resonate with your readers? If not, do you have any just advice or feedback for me of how I can craft this to make it better? Again, just be mindful. Journalists do have a pretty tedious schedule, but again, a lot of them are inclined to at least give some feedback every once in a while. And again, if you're presenting it in a way that's not demanding, if you're not telling them, hey, look, I need you to look at this, but if you have some time, a lot of them will treat you just as they would like any other individuals. And at the end of the day, they are all individuals just like you and I. And last but not least, as I mentioned on the previous slide, just prepare for the long haul. Pitching, it does take time. It does take practice. There's no one size fits all approach to doing it best. Again, the example today is just one example. There's going to be a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different variables to consider when you're doing this, but just realize it is a long game. You're in it for the long haul. And the more patience that you can practice, again, the more that you can recognize that, you know, I might not get that response back today, but how can I maybe revisit this message? How can I tailor it more personally to those individuals? The more you can remember, just again, continuing to optimize and reminding yourself about that long haul, the better off you're going to be when it comes down to it. So thank you guys. I really, really appreciate you listening to my chat today. I hope you all again found it really valuable and got some insights out of it. I'm just going to take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about OnePitch and why we are the experts in this space. Not only are we working with over 2,000 publicists, media relations brands, or excuse me, media brands, as well as news publications and outlets, we've been able to secure hundreds of success stories for those individuals. And what we wanted to present to you today was just a couple of pieces of information that will aid you to craft pitches and to kind of get you a little bit more insights into this space. So for starters, if anybody wants to sign up for a free account, you can do so at onepitch.co. Again, that's a free account. You would sign up as a publicist, and what you would be able to do is take advantage of pitching journalists, receiving pitches and responding to them from journalists, as well as creating profiles about your brand and adding them to our brand database, which journalists have access to. Aside from the service, we've got a couple of other resources that we're working on right now. One of them is our podcast, which we just launched the second season of last week. It's called Coffee with a Journalist. You can find this on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, and all the other major streaming services. That show, we actually sit down one-on-one with real journalists, and we go through a list of questions to not only ask them about their background, but to ask them about how they write their stories. We also include some fun segments in there, so you get to know them a little bit better on a personal level, not just on a professional level. Aside from our podcast, we've got weekly blogs that we produce. All of that content tends to be more closely related to, again, public relations and marketing best practices. We've got a lot of how-to pieces that we produce. We've got some profiles about individuals. But again, it's a great resource center if you guys are looking to learn a little bit more about this space. Moving along with that, we also have ebooks and cheat sheets, which we include in a lot of our blogs. These are, again, really, really helpful resources. They're good to reference if you're looking at pitching some individuals, and really give you some guidance as far as how you want to set up that information, what's most important to include, and again, just looking at some of those best practices. And last but not least, I wanted to tell you all about our Twitter chat that we're launching next week. It's called Twitter with the Journalist. And what we're doing is kind of taking the same fundamental philosophy from our podcast and bringing that to real time on Twitter. Some of you might be familiar with some Twitter chats. Our concept, again, is a little bit different. We're doing a live chat. So we're talking one-on-one with these journalists. We're asking them a series of questions, really trying to gain some insights and get a better understanding of who they are, especially given the time right now with coronavirus and kind of the shift of news stories and how stories are being pitched and written. I would highly recommend you guys follow along. Again, TWJ chat on Thursday, 4/16 to join us. And thanks again, everyone. I really, really appreciate you guys joining in today. Again, I hope you found it valuable. If you want to follow us, we're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook at OnePitchSAS. We got a couple of different hashtags that you can also follow along with. If you wanted to get in touch with me or any of our other team members, you can email us info@onepitch.co or head to our website for more information. Thank you so much again, and have a great day, you guys. Cheers.